Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series, where we look at a couple of competition designs and ask our in-house AI, DesignEye, to analyse those designs and give us some suggestions for improvements based on the principles and elements of design, which is how our work is judged when it's in competition. This week the two designs are one with a title called Integrated, which was to be constructed with mixed media, and the other is a country wedding, and this was an imposé design or an imposed design where everyone in the competition is supplied with the material to use for the design. Let's first of all look at a country wedding. As I said, this was an imposed design, so the staging for it was a base of 1 metre square with a 2 metre high backing board, so we needed to use all of that contained space for the design. We had 3 hours to complete the design. It was to be judged from the front and the sides, and 80% of the material that was supplied had to be used. Now the two timber stumps that you can see there were already placed in the work area, and we were not permitted to move them simply because of the weight of them and the health and safety issues that might entail. So everything else was supplied and we had to work out how to use it. We didn't know the title for the competition until 15 minutes before our time started. This is an annual competition, so we're all quite aware that that's what is going to be the case, and it's part of an agricultural show, and the supplies of the plant material are donated by a very well-known wholesaler, and so they specialise in Australian native flora, so all of what we had to use was Australian native flora, always all in really good condition, and some unusual pieces that we wouldn't normally see, as well as things that we're probably a little bit more used to using. The additional issue, I guess, for this competition is that the wholesaler, the supplier, doesn't like anyone to use foam, and indeed Australian native plant material doesn't fare well in foam. So we had buckets and other containers that were to be used, tin buckets and other containers that were to be used, that had been supplied as well in terms of the water source for the material that we felt needed a water source. It doesn't all need a water source, the Australian native. Some of it will last quite well in terms of this competition. This is on display for 4 days. It gets judged immediately after the 3 hours of staging, but it is on display for 4 days. So let's see what DesignEye has got to say about this particular composition. For line, first of all, the design features strong vertical lines created by the tall black floral elements. That's the xanthorrhea or the black boy spikes, grass tree spikes. The horizontal lines are established by the log pieces and the horizontal floral arrangement. These lines add structure and guide the viewer's eye through the design. In terms of shape, the cylindrical shapes of the logs and the vertical floral elements are prominent. Additionally, the round and flowing shapes of the floral arrangements add softness and contrast to the rigid shapes. So that it's an interesting concept for me to look at now, because I remember at the time all I wanted to do was get the design up. 3 hours is not a lot of time when you have to decide what you're going to do. You've got to look at the material, decide what you're going to do, and then actually do the construction itself. So it's quite an intense period of time. And what I wanted to do with this design was to have it as though this was where the signing of the register took place. So the taller of the two logs has actually got an area with a little glass jar that has got a single flower in it and an area for a pen, and so it looks like it might be an open book type of area where you would sign the register, and that's why the two slices are placed at the base there for people to stand on. So it was just a decorative element as part of the wedding activities. For form, the design is three-dimensional with various heights and depths created by the logs, the floral arrangements and the decorative elements. This adds visual interest and depth to the composition. It's actually quite a difficult space to fill because it's bigger than you expect it to be, just because the backboard is that 2 metres high and 2 metres wide. I think, now that I'm thinking about it, I think it is actually, I think I've given you the wrong dimensions, but in essence it's a cube of 2 meters, and it's odd because you need to work out how you're going to get that depth in your design, particularly because it is judged from the sides as well. So it's got to be interesting from the sides as well as from the front. For texture, there's a rich variety of textures, including the rough bark of the logs, the soft and delicate flowers, the coarse burlap or hessian, and the spiky vertical floral elements, so the spears from the grass trees. This textural diversity enhances the tactile appeal of the design. And that's very true. I think it's interesting with Australian natives because there's such a variety of textures and forms within the Australian natives that it's not as difficult for us when we're working with that material to get that contrast of the textures. That said, I do prefer to work with Australian natives, so maybe that's just me thinking that it's easier to do it that way. The colour palette consists of natural and earthy tones with greens, browns and pops of pink, red and yellow from the flowers. These colours are harmonious and evoke a rustic country feel, which is great because that's what I wanted. The arrangement effectively uses both positive and negative space. The open spaces between the logs and the floral elements prevent the design from feeling overcrowded and allow each component to stand out. I guess that's true. My concern, and I think the concern of many of the competitors on the day, was that the logs were going to be very dominant in any design that we did, and so we needed to do something that would keep your eye moving around the logs rather than always be drawn back to them. I still feel like they're quite dominant, and I don't think that the way I've put the bark at the bottom helps that. I think it draws you back to those two central logs that are there. The design achieves asymmetrical balance. The varying heights of the logs and the placement of floral elements create visual stability without being symmetrical. The design feels grounded yet dynamic, and that's a reflection of the fact that I've got that on the front log, the lower log, I've got more of the floral material. What you can't see in this image is that there's also a bucket on the ground between the two logs that's got some of the foliage in it. So you can see a little bit of it poking through, but it's almost a reflection of that one that is on top of the log, but with more foliage in it. Contrast is evident in the use of different textures and colours. The roughness of the logs contrasts with the softness of the flowers, and the dark vertical elements contrast with the lighter, more colourful blooms. That's true. I guess when looking at it, my concern is that the flower spikes from the grass trees, the black elements, are very dominant in terms of their visual colour against that background, and I haven't really incorporated that well enough. But we'll see when we get to the improvements, the suggested improvements, what DesignEye's got to say for us around that issue. The focal point appears to be the central floral arrangement on the tallest log, which immediately draws the viewer's eye due to its prominence and the concentration of colourful flowers. Yes. I guess my hesitation is that I don't think there's enough of a focal point. I don't think there's a single focal point. I think that the composition of the two logs and that combined area of decoration and the repetition of the hessian gives it that central area is the focal area rather than an individual point within the arrangement. Rhythm is created through the repetition of elements such as the logs, floral arrangements and the burlap or hessian decorations. This repetition creates a visual flow and guides the viewer's eye through the design. So yes, yep, that's essentially what I was saying, is that because there's rhythm and because you flow through the design, you don't really stop at any one point. My eye doesn't anyway. But I guess it's like that with anything that we have put together. We tend to know what we did and know what we were trying to do, and so our eye and our brain just keeps filling in the gaps for us rather than look at it independently without all of that background knowledge. The design feels cohesive due to the consistent use of natural materials and a harmonious colour palette. The rustic theme is consistently applied throughout the arrangement, and that's very much in terms of the materials that were supplied, so it's good that I have incorporated all of those materials, because sometimes in an impose we get material and we think, how on earth am I going to do it? I remember one year for this particular design, we got a whole lot of yellow wool, and there was no other yellows in the flowers particularly, and I thought I had no idea how I was going to use it, and actually struggled with that for a long time before I got to use it. So it's good that what was supplied helped it to be unified and harmonious. The proportions of the elements are well considered. The size of the floral arrangements in relation to the logs and the surrounding space is balanced and visually pleasing, and that is very important, because as I said, it was so difficult for me to work out how I was going to lessen the dominance of those logs, that I needed to have the rest of the plant material in proportion so that you weren't immediately drawn and stopped by the logs and everything else just looked a bit out of place. So what I've done is massed the floral material, so rather than have the individual placements or lots of smaller placements, massed it all together in both the top bucket and the bottom bucket that you can't see as well. And that has given that balance and proportion to the design. So let's have a look now at what DesignEye has said might be some improvements to create a greater sense of balance, depth and visual richness, enhancing its rustic and charming qualities. Now, enhance the vertical lines. The tall black floral elements could be more integrated into the design. Adding additional vertical elements of varying heights could create a more dynamic and balanced composition. And I think that's very true. I think that using those floral spears, the black boy floral spikes, in that way, whilst it's given me some width to the design and a framework for the logs, it's not repeated anywhere. And so I needed to think about how to place them a little bit differently so that they were a bit more grouped together and repeated in other areas. So I probably could have had one smaller one right at the front of the design, at the front of the smaller of the logs, so that it was incorporated more into the design. Refine the base. The base of the arrangement, currently covered with bark mulch, could be refined to enhance the presentation. And I think that's very true. I think that I seem to recall got to a point where I still had this bucket of bark chips to use somehow in the design, and I've dumped it basically and just done the circle around the design itself, hoping that it would look like, that was the path that was leading up to it. But I've repeated that circle, which is fine, because we've got the circle of the timber rounds and we've got the circular form of the logs, but it doesn't add anything to the design, and it's just this big bulk base once again, it's not repeated anywhere else, so perhaps I should have had some of the bark chips up on the top of the logs as well, so that there was a bit more repetition of that element in the design, but also not having it in the circle, having it as a swirl, having it as thinner lines, having it as a starch, anything else other than that big blob of bark chips, I think would have improved the design. So I very much agree with that suggestion. Improve the burlap application. The burlap wraps or the hessian wraps around the logs could be tightened and shaped more precisely. Adding more decorative elements like bows or floral accents to the burlap could enhance its aesthetic appeal. Interesting that it's picked up the fact that they're not tied as tightly around the logs as perhaps I would have liked, and once again I think that's very true, and I could have done more with it. I could have plaited it, I could have changed the shape of it, I could have festooned it so that it had elements of the floral material catching areas of it and made it something more of a feature rather than just a cover up. I know now, looking at it, that a lot of my thinking was about lessening the dominance of the logs, and so covering it up with as much hessian as I could was probably the right thing to do. But when you have the opportunity to look back at these designs, you can see where just little things would add such a different dimension to the design and improve it in terms of its interpretation of the title. So there we have our first design, the country wedding imposé. Let's now move on to our second design, which is mixed media, called integrated. So integrated using mixed media. Now this was one of the very first times that mixed media was stipulated in a floral art competition that I had entered. This was a competition that was online, so it wasn't judged physically, it was judged based on an image that was submitted. This is the image that was submitted. I tried it with a black background as well as with the lighter coloured background, and it looked better against the lighter coloured background. The width was 70 centimetres, and it was judged from the front, obviously, because of the one image being submitted. There wasn't a stipulation for design style, and so I determined that I would have it as something that could possibly be a wall hanging, but was actually staged on the bench for the image being taken. So it's basically constructed with some art canvases that have been collaged with some paper serviettes, and then I've added a whole lot of other elements to it. I wanted to incorporate some plant-based material, so I've got pasta there, and I've got banana skins and the twigs, and alströmerias as the flowers, and lemons and bamboo skewers, and the other elements that are non-plant is there's some wool in there and some wire in there as well, just to add another dimension of mixed media, I guess, for this particular design. Since that time, I will say, there's been a number of organisations that have looked at the definition of mixed media in terms of floral art, and so if you're faced now with a competition where you are allowed to use mixed media, which is a nice challenge, it's good to try something new, then make sure that you get the definition of how it's going to be judged in terms of that mixed media phrase, so that you're very clear about what you can use and what will be considered in terms of the judging. So let's now let DesignEye have a look at this particular design and tell us all about it. Looking at line, first of all, the design incorporates various types of lines, including the curving lines of the woven elements, the vertical lines of the plant stems, and the angular lines of the branches. These lines create a dynamic flow throughout the piece. That's true. I guess my concern looking at it now is that it's just messy. There's not enough repetition of the shapes and of the plant material for me to be comfortable about this as a design. That might just be because I'm not a great fan of contemporary and modern art either, and so this is a bit in those categories too, so it might just be my eye that's not as attuned perhaps as DesignEye is. The shapes in this design are diverse, featuring circular forms from the woven elements and rectangular shapes from the background and the small box. The combination of organic and geometric shapes adds visual interest. So it's a very measured comment from DesignEye. The design is three-dimensional, with elements protruding at different depths, creating a sense of volume and space. The overlapping layers enhance the depth of the composition. That's very much what I was going for in terms of the depth, because it is hard with a wall hanging to get a sense of depth, and I needed to be able to give a sense of depth because it was going to be judged on an image, not a physical location. So I needed to ensure that that depth would be obvious, and that the forms of the elements that were used would help that depth be obvious. There's a rich mix of textures, from the rough branches and twine to the smooth leaves and flowers. The texture variety makes the design visually and tactilely engaging. That's probably true. I guess I'm a bit concerned once again about the repetition and the obvious differences between the textures. So there's light, there's not a whole lot of dark, there's a few elements of dark. There's rough and smooth, but there's not shiny and there's not flat. And so there's probably elements that I could improve on. They're shiny in terms of the wire, but it's too hard to see in the image, and it's just one little spider web that's hanging down, so it's not really as obvious as it could be in terms of a texture and a contrast. The colour palette includes natural greens and yellows, complemented by neutral tones of beige and white from the mixed media elements. The use of a patterned background with lemons adds a vibrant and playful touch, and that was very much the theme of it. I wanted to experiment with doing that collage style of background with the paper serviettes, so I knew I needed to use the lemons, and I thought that the green of the foliage from the serviettes would match the nice dark green in the alströmerias, and you can get a good yellow in an alströmeria, so I thought that was a different shape and form, although the colour was going to be repeated, so I thought that was probably the best flower I could use in this instance. The arrangement uses both positive and negative space effectively. The open areas around the circular woven elements allow the design to breathe and prevent it from appearing too cluttered. Yeah, I think it is too cluttered, personally. I just think it's just too busy. The background is busy, and I haven't played to that by keeping the elements in front of it. So the circular part and the branches, I haven't kept them as sleek and refined as they could have been. The design achieves asymmetrical balance. The visual weight is distributed unevenly, with the larger, more complex elements on the left side balanced by the smaller elements on the right. I'm not convinced that it's balanced as well as it should be. Once again, very critical of this particular one. Contrast is present in the use of different textures, shapes and colours. The smoothness of the leaves contrasts with the roughness of the twine and the branches, and the vibrant lemon pattern contrasts with the natural elements. And that's true, but as I've said earlier, there's not... The contrast in textures, I think, is what I'm missing, plus that cleaner look that I prefer in my designs in terms of the balance. I just don't think there's enough contrast between the background, which jumps out at me every time I look at this image, and the plant elements that are part of the design. Focal point appears to be the circular woven elements at the centre, which immediately draw the viewer's eye due to their complexity and central placement. Shame, because I didn't really want that to be the emphasis, and I can see what it is, but for me, I keep getting drawn to the background, and I don't want that to be the emphasis either. So this design really needed a lot more thinking before it was submitted. But that's how it goes. You give it your best at the time, and then in hindsight you've always got a lot more ideas about what you could have done better. Rhythm is created through the repetition of circular forms and the use of twine and branches. This repetition guides the viewer's eye through the design in an harmonious way. So yes, there is rhythm in the design to a certain extent. I think there's rhythm at the top and in the middle, and I think it loses a bit of the rhythm at the bottom. Yes, you get drawn through the design, but there's a couple of things that are sticking out that don't appear to be part of the design. So once again, that's something that I would want to improve next time I tried it. Despite the variety of elements, the design feels cohesive. The consistent colour palette and natural theme unify the different components. Yes, that's good. I guess it is unified in a sense. It's probably not as unified, once again, as I would like it to be. I just feel like there's too many bits sticking out that might or might not be part of what the design is trying to show us. The proportions of the elements are well balanced. The larger woven circles are proportionate to the size of the background, and the smaller details complement the overall composition without overwhelming it. Now, this is where I wonder about the smaller box that's got the lemon inside it. I wanted that to be, I actually wanted that to be the feature. I wanted to be drawn down to look at that, and that's why it's placed where it is. But now that I look at it, it's not quite part of the design. It's not quite as cohesive as I would like it. And proportion-wise, it probably could be about a third bigger, just to be in proportion with the other background elements that are there. But that's my view, and I shouldn't be too critical because that doesn't help you and it might help me. Now let's look at some suggestions now that might help give the design greater visual impact, depth and cohesion, enhancing its mixed media approach while maintaining its dynamic and engaging qualities. Enhance the focal point, yes. To strengthen the emphasis on the focal point, consider adding a slightly larger or more vibrant floral element near the centre woven circle. This could draw more attention and enhance the focal area. So yes, I totally agree with this. I need to determine where the focal area is going to be and then make sure that I've got that populated with plant material so that it is the focal point. Increase the colour variation. Introducing a few more colours such as soft pinks or purples could add depth and interest to the design. These colours could be subtly incorporated into the floral elements or mixed media components. Interesting suggestion in terms of the colours, because I hadn't considered anything outside of the greens and yellows and the beiges and the darker colour for the twigs. So I would have to experiment with it and have a look at it, because it's very hard for me to visualise pinks and purples in the design other than, as it says, incorporating into some of the mixed media, so perhaps into some of the background, so having a wash that was a very pale pink rather than the white where the serviette is on the first of the frames. I definitely would want to play around with the colour and see what that added to it. I can see that it would add more depth to the design by having those other colours there, and that's something obviously that I mentioned earlier that I wanted to improve on. Refine the use of mixed media. The integration of mixed media could be more seamless. For instance, blending the edges of the pattern background with the natural elements using additional twine or small branches could create a more cohesive look. And that's very true, and that's something that it just comes with practice. As I said, this was the first time I'd attempted mixed media. I didn't really know what it meant in terms of floral art. Nobody did. It was very early days for us to be allowed to think of a design using mixed media. And so I can see how those suggestions would help me to incorporate the media more fully into an overall design. Improve the base. The base of the arrangement could be more polished. Adding a decorative tray or a uniform fabric that matches the theme of the design could enhance the overall presentation. And once again, very true. The trap that I sometimes fall into when I'm putting designs together is that I forget that it needs something at the bottom to bring it all together. I'm so focused on the design and what it's looking like that I forget that if I don't have something underneath the design itself is going to blend into the base or the staging area, and that becomes part of the design. So the black base here becomes part of the design, and that doesn't help the design. Had I had something that was, even if I had a tray that was covered with the serviettes, so that was repeated as the base as well, you can visualise how much of an improvement that would make to this overall design. So there we have our two designs for this week. That's the country wedding impose and our mixed media called integrated. I, as always, encourage you to submit your own designs to have them analysed so that you can also gain the benefit of learning about principles and elements of design and how your designs meet those criteria and how they could be enhanced to improve the designs. All of the designs that get submitted are reviewed and analysed by our AI DesignEye, but they are also checked by a human judge to make sure that the information that you're getting is going to be useful for you. That's our lot for this week. Join us again next time. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Online, Designs Dissected.